summarised by 3 C's: cities, citizenship, and care. She's currently focusing on the connections between citizenship, vulnerability, and the politics of care. And she will answer the question of who cares for freedom and why care is a condition for emancipation. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is my first live event with so many people, so I'm pretty excited and a little bit nervous. Thank you and congratulations on the lustrum. I understand that that is the occasion of the event. I planned a presentation that is based on my interests on vulnerability, care, and citizenship. I'm a social and political theorist, so I've always liked to scrutinize the concepts that I use to work. So the presentation has some conceptual cleavage. And so before we start, I learned in the years I've been teaching that if you're going to ask people to drive with you intellectually, you need them comfortable in their body. And since we all have just lunch, I'm going to ask you for 1 minute to stand up and to sort of embody your presence in the church. That sounds very appropriate. So, shake, lift, exhale, drop it, shake it off. And now we can ask an important question. Who cares for freedom? Please, sit down. I'm going to organize the presentation along these 4 points. I'm going to start with a story that actually found accidentally yesterday in the newspaper, and I think speaks about what I want to talk to you today. It's a story about domestic slavery, freedom, and care in various levels. Then I'm going to move to the concept of freedom and the modern definition of freedom that I'm sure as a political scientist, because I think most of you are IR students or have that background, you're familiar with it. And how that connects with the unavoidable interdependence of human beings. Then I'm going to delve deeper into care and why we need care in order to think about freedom, but also in order to exercise it. And then I'm going to close with an argument, perhaps, about why care is a condition of human emancipation. So the story, to begin, is a story that appeared yesterday in The Guardian. It's yet another story of a Filipino woman who escaped the perilous conditions in which she was living as a domestic worker in a mansion in South Kensington in February 2019. Exploited and abused, foreign and often racialized women live in conditions of modern slavery, working in wealthy families in the north and in the south. They do so independently of the political regimes and the state of the rule of law in the countries where they live. In the text of the newspaper, the case, the woman that spoke about her case was a saying, and I'm quoting, "Domestic servitude is one of the most prevalent forms of modern slavery in the UK and largely affects foreign domestic workers from places such as Philippines and Indonesia. The places we go in London, the streets are full of expensive cars and the houses cost millions of pounds, but inside there are women being treated like slaves and nobody knows." This enslavement is often the result of actually their choice. In the case of these women, she left the Philippines in search for better opportunities of life. She left a life of poverty with small children in search of work that would help her support her family. Hunted by the specter of poverty and violence, in search of opportunities to free herself free themselves. These women often become trafficked with the complaisance of institutions in their home countries and in their host countries, abused and exploited. The women in this article describe the situation as one where they are stripped from their humanity. Now, how does this story connect to the modern definition of freedom? The modern definition of freedom is one that exaltates the idea of the individual. We often think about individual freedom along two axes. Freedom of choice, that is an internal life project, and freedom from coercion, that is freedom from external constraints. Zygmunt Bauman has described freedom as a social relation. He writes, "The free individual, far from being a universal condition of humankind, is a historical and social creation." So in this sense, Bauman describes in his book that instead of being a property, something that the individual possesses, freedom is a privileged quality that describes certain differences between individuals. And it makes sense only as an opposition to some other condition. Freedom creates an asymmetry of conditions between individuals in their past or in their present. Bauman describes our modern freedom as a freedom of the consumer. And it can be so if you think of it in terms of choice or absence of constraints to decide individually what you want to do with your life. In fact, modern societies, in modern societies, individual liberty has been conceptualized largely as a matter of non-interference. You might be familiar with Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of freedom. Even Berlin argued that freedom is enjoyed as long as I am not prevented by other person from doing what I want to do. So, the domestic worker in the study in The Guardian was free to do what she wanted to do. That is, search for a possibility of a better life or a better work that would help her support her family. Berlin argues this in the two senses of liberty that he theorized. The negative freedom, or freedom from coercion and or unnecessary interference in the pursuit of one's individual goals, and his positive freedom, that is a freedom to act towards a self-realization, right? Critics of Berlin argue that these two ideas actually fall under the modern paradigm that for Bauman is described as the freedom of the consumer. Quentin Skinner actually criticizes this under the fact that these under the premise that these conceptualizations do not offer a sufficient condition for freedom to exist. Neither the non-interference nor the freedom of choice can grant us the possibility to be free, since in neither case they preclude individuals from falling into, and I'm quoting, conditions of unavoidable dependence on the goodwill of others. So Skinner's argument develops along the lines that the state then has the duty to protect its citizens and individuals from these avoidable dependencies. Now, is dependence avoidable? And here's where the argument that I want to put forward today starts. Dependence is only avoidable if we use a language of choices that mask coerced consent, in the case of the Filipino domestic worker that I was just telling you, and naturalizes an epistemic ignorance or inattendance about whose care burdens afford dependence to become avoidable and invisible to whom. So I'm trying to argue here that freedom doesn't sit any longer in the realm of the public independent of need, if you want to follow Hannah Arendt's distinction between the private sphere as the sphere of needs, and the public sphere as the political sphere, and the sphere where we can exercise our rational freedom. But actually in transcending that dichotomy, because dependence is actually actually unavoidable, and not being aware of it is a privilege. In a way, a private autonomy rests and is learned as a form of inattentiveness towards the social reproductive work that enables that autonomy to exist, often by under and devalued forms of care work. By drawing on an ideal of autonomy as independence, as Susan Dodds argue, policymakers too readily discount the ways and the skills and the capacities required to develop autonomy and acquired in and shaped through relations of care, social institutions, and legal recognition. Care work is, under these premises, either when it's paid or unpaid or formal or informal, a consequence of political choices, shared beliefs in a society, and established gender norms. The COVID pandemic has shown how these patterns affect women disproportionately, often in disadvantages, often creating systemic disadvantages. We know the pandemic has not been a good period for women's rights, even if it has certainly had different impact in different contexts and different countries. In general terms, from homeschooling to losing jobs, to domestic violence, to the drop in girls' education, and the decrease in the availability of contraceptives, the impact of the pandemic in women is alarming. Women have done by far the majority of the childcare and homeschooling during the pandemic. This has been true for women all around the world who were already doing 2 to 10 times more unpaid care work and domestic work in their home than their men, according to the OECD. This obviously has undermined their ability to do paid work, but it has also affected physical and mental health of women. Independence, in this sense, this idea of private autonomy, is a fiction, because it has the pernicious effect of encourage a society where we hide the ways in which we all have needs that are met in relations of dependency and care. The fiction turns those whose dependence cannot be masked into pariahs or makes them objects of disdain or pity. And in turn, it tends to devaluate the work of care workers. Caring well, often in our societies, requires an injustice for others. This means that those that engage in the work of doing the care work are often not cared for, like in the case of the domestic worker I was just telling you at the beginning. I'm quoting here John Tronto, one of the main figures of the studies of care and care ethics. Caring in our society does not function in an egalitarian manner, writes Tronto. The distribution of caring work and who is cared for serves to maintain and to reinforce patterns of subordination. Those who care are made still less important because their needs are not as important as their needs of those privileged enough to be able to pay others to care for them. In fact, even if care work in society creates and is the source of a lot of wealth, as a chart from Oxfam illustrates, with everybody now working long hours in paid work, caring has become increasingly outsourced, privatized, and neglected. While a managerial vernacular dominates caring professionals with an extreme bureaucratization of care relations. It's just a matter of going to a hospital and see how much effort is put into tracking the care system instead of bed manners or increasing or fostering an environment of care. All this has led to an unprecedented crisis of care, as the pandemic and the story I told at the beginning about the domestic worker show. Like the Oxfam chart shows of a recent publication that is titled Time to Care, the example of domestic care workers, and the example of the domestic care workers in London illustrates, the expansion and the success of the feminist agenda has also been a double sword progress. In terms of gender rights, it has certainly granted some women the necessary personal autonomy in their private spheres to participate in the public sphere, to be part of the labor market on equal terms, more or less. Yet, if one adds other types of inequalities and engage in a more intersectional approach to the inequalities derived from care work, particularly in terms of time and in terms of poverty and race, this inclusion of women in the public sphere, politics and labor market, has reproduced cycles of gender privilege and gender vulnerability, like the story of the domestic worker I just showed, based on who does the care work and who can be oblivious of it. So, why do we need care to think and to exercise freedom? Because unless democratic societies are able to deal substantively with the question of who cares in society and what type of care is needed for the reproduction of the social order, individuals will continue to be misconceived in their everyday lives. Overhauling their lives as workers and devaluing their lives as people engaged in relationships of care with one another. Since the COVID-19 started, and against the care washing that companies use to make themselves look better in the midst of the crisis, we all have experienced how fundamental it is to have a network of structures of support for the pursuit of our daily lives. From schools to hospitals, to nursing homes, to food markets, to street cleaners, and to garbage collectors. Care work is at the center of what it is to be human and to live with others in a society. And yet, care work is often belittled, devalued, and neglected. Martha Fineman, an American legal scholar, argues that the unjust distribution of caring labor in society can render caregivers themselves vulnerable. So, we need to rethink care as an issue of social justice. She argues for aggregated caretaking. So she speaks about the caring state. Because without an aggregate caretaking, there could be no society. So we might say that it is caretaking labor that produces and reproduces society. The uncompensated labor of caretakers is an unrecognized subsidy, not only to individuals who directly receive it, but more significantly to the entire society. In reality, we are all interdependent. This means we all rely upon the care of others in different degrees throughout the course of our lives, with more or less intensity. Acknowledging it, or not, is a sign of our socioeconomic, racial, gender, cultural, and epistemic privilege. So, what is care? I'm going to use, and I'm relying on a definition of care that John Tronto and Fisher put forward in the early 1990s. They describe care as one of the most, on the most general level. We suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we need to do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Care is not located in an individual body, but is the result of a network of relations that support that body, our bodies. Toronto has spoken and written about 4 stages of care. She speaks about the importance of thinking how we care about things. So what type of attentiveness, what type of attention we give to specific issues, and which ones remain neglected in this sort of epistemic ignorance. She speaks about a state where we need to take care of and assume responsibilities. And here, the private and public dichotomy, gender and race power dynamics are important in configuring who takes care of whom. And then she speaks about the two dimensions of caregiving and care receiving, with caregiving given a contextual competence that often rests on the professionalization of care, but more often than not, when it's done well, it is a situated practice of engagement with one another, and care receiving as a stage of responsiveness that highlights the unequal distribution of vulnerabilities in society. So to end, I've been speaking so far in an attempt to make visible why care can be thought of and can be practiced as a condition of emancipation. What is the political language we use to speak about freedom? The history of philosophy, political theory, and intellectual history will give us different answers to that question, to the question, what is freedom, depending on the position and the historical time from where we ask the question. I like to suggest here that for our societies, we cannot any longer afford to define freedom in terms of choices and the lack of constraints. The question is not any longer a modern question, and it doesn't refer to the preeminence of the individual in society. The individual is not born. It becomes one thanks to relations of interdependency and care throughout a life span. The self-reliant modern autonomy is a myth because no one is born an individual. Rather, one becomes one thanks to mutual relations of dependency with others, humans and non-humans. What makes our lives characteristically human, writes Martha Fineman, is the capacity for self-determination, rational, emotional, and relational agency. Thus, she writes, human needs are inextricably bound up with human agency. Caring is the process of responding to another's needs by understanding their self-determined ends, adopting those ends as one owns, and advancing them in an effort to cultivate, maintain, or restore their agency. As the individual and society societal need for care illustrates, freedom cannot rest on the absence of constraints to exercise private autonomy, but rather by changing and transcending the informal structures of the private-public divide that support that idea of private autonomy and tend to oppose freedom and care. So what I had tried to argue so far is that freedom and care are not opposite, but are mutually constitutive. Care is a condition for negative and positive freedom to exist. Care is a situated, political, and conflicting practice of doing and thinking about the self, others, and the networks of human and non-human interdependencies that support our daily lives. Its organization can take many forms, but independently of that, everyone needs to establish relations of care. Freedom is the result of a social relation, as Bauman was reminding us, and as such, always a possibility. Care is the condition that enables that possibility. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking on a topic which is often neglected, but one which I, as a cultural anthropologist, find extremely interesting. Thank you. Our next speaker is Julianne Vegels, who is from the University of Amsterdam. She is an assistant professor of Latin American research and documentation with an expertise in gender and social inequalities, violence, insecurity, and criminalization. And she will speak on the gender dynamics of protest and imprisonment related to the mass demonstrations that have been happening in Latin America since 2018. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. And it's indeed so strange to be in front of actual faces and people that have bodies rather than just little heads on a screen. Yes. So my presentation is going to be about the fight for justice and freedom. And I would say, as it also feeds into the feminist project, it is definitely about this freedom within a caring network rather than the freedom of doing what one wants without taking into account what other people might want or the freedoms of others. I'm going to talk a little bit about the gender dynamics of protests and particularly women in protest in Latin America. So first, I'm going to give you a little overview of Latin America and women's rights. Given the session is titled Freedom and Women's Rights, I thought it would be a good idea to see what is the state of women's rights in that regard, and why are women mobilizing and still protesting in that regard. And then the different types of roles that women assume in protest, the different types of protests that women engage in, also, of course, together with men. I am a gender scholar, and actually my own focus tends to be much more on masculinity. We do have to see these as relational concepts, as women don't exist without men. Like there's a mutual relation between the two, and it's also often necessary to see men as gendered beings as well, and not men as this natural thing and women as the gendered being. But men are also gendered and engage in gendered behavior. And then particularly I'm also going to talk a little bit about the ways in which protests are repressed and the ways in which these forms of repression are also gendered. And in that sense also about how violence becomes gendered. So with regards to women's rights in Latin America, there have been a lot of advances in terms of the implementation of, for instance, laws against domestic violence, laws against gender-based violence. Often the two are interrelated or even used interchangeably. We can discuss about that, how useful that is or not. But the fact that a lot of these legal packages, which have been, of course, rallied around for extensively and have built on the effort of a lot of people, especially women, to make that happen. In that sense, thinking back a little bit and taking up the UN part of the title of your association, your student association, the role of the Women's Year that started in 1975 and the UN Women's Decade, which ran from 76 to 86. And the different kinds of issues that were tackled in that decade and after that decade, or kind of established as mainstream ideas for women's emancipation in that period, including, for instance, the possibility for women to be landowners, to hold property, the possibility for women to vote, though that was, in most cases, a little bit earlier, but as one of the speakers reminded us of this morning, women's vote in Switzerland was not until the 70s. So there are, of course, all of these issues that we now take for granted that build on decades of mobilization for women's rights. In the case of Latin America, as I mentioned, a lot of this legislation was passed, but in many cases it remained at this legalistic point this legalistic framework, it turned into a paper reality that in not all cases also, trickled down to being a lived reality for women in the continent, particularly in relation to impunity. So even if we consider, for instance, the implementation of laws against gender-based violence or domestic violence, and considering that quite few women actually take the step to go to the police to denounce this type of violence, then what happens after this denunciation is done, is it taken seriously by the police? Is it taken seriously by the judge? Is there actually some form of punishment for the person who engages in this behavior? All of those steps require effort, and in many cases, impunity is still a large part of the lived reality. So the fact that when crimes are committed against women, the perpetrators are not found, there's no effort made for them to be brought to justice. Hence also the justice part of the title. On the other hand, from Latin America, this context of violence, we also see the emergence of the term femicide. You're probably familiar with it. It's the murder of a woman on the basis that she is a woman, or in this subordinate relationship of being the woman. But beyond that, the need we should all engage into gender violence. And gendering violence means looking at also how male deaths, for instance, are justified as taking, for instance, the war on drugs, the fact that if, let's say in Latin America particularly, when police engage in raids, the free-for-all kind of, if it's a man standing on the other side of the wall with a gun and I'm a man on the other side of the wall with a gun, then we have this right to exercise violence against one another. And the fact that still, despite the high levels of femicide, there is a lot of male-on-male violence that is also similarly justified on the basis of gender roles. And somehow we don't see that as gendered violence. Now, feminist movements and women's movements in Latin America draw a lot of attention to the practices of oppression that come forth out of the institutionalized policing of gender norms. So how we should behave as women or how we should behave as men. I'm adding the men part to this as well because there's obviously a lot of policing around sexual orientation, for instance. So properly being a man or properly being a woman also implies properly being heterosexual. So the institutions that generally police people's gender performances and kind of enact small or larger acts of punishment if people fall out of line is on a small scale, of course, the family unit as the people that bring you up, who do indeed exercise care for you, but who can also be the ones who instill with you a set of norms that can also partially be oppressive. Of course, above the family, there are these structures within society that create and reproduce and maintain norms, which are, on the one hand, religion, on the other hand, the state, often in a combination or synergy between the two. And we can think of all types of other forms of institutions that fall under one or the other, like schooling, education, police, the actual police, not the policing practices, that are also engaged in how, in shaping and policing how we should behave as gendered beings. So women who participate in protest sometimes, work against these notions, and sometimes pick up gender roles that are very much permitted by the triangle that I just demonstrated. So there are different roles of women in protest, and I'm going to just draw out a couple of them and give you some examples, because I think the nice part is seeing what women actually do on the street. So I'm going to draw some attention to feminist protest. I'm going to draw some attention to women protesting as mothers. I'm also going to draw some attention to perhaps the combination of both, in the sense of feminist women participating in larger forms of protest or big societal mass demonstrations, and so women also just as citizens who are of course gendered beings, but not necessarily protesting on the basis of their gender role. And then this fight, the broader fight for justice and freedom that is kind of woven through all of these forms of protest. So feminist protest in Latin America is often organized at machismo. Can I see a show of hands of who knows what machismo is? Okay, that's not so many, so I'm going to give a very brief explanation. Machismo is a gender system or a system of productive relations that orders these relations from the base of taking patriarchy as a basis. I'm sure that you all know what a macho man is or macho behavior. This idea of being overly masculine or promoting misogyny or sexist behavior. Machismo as a system of productive relations enforces this heteronormativity, enforces the notion that men and women are not essentially compatible. So that, let's say that relations between men and women can only be sexual, and they cannot be for other purposes. So it's either within the family, or if it's in the social environment, it tends to be very separate. So the promotion of what are called homosocial spaces. Think about the military as a homosocial space where men are only with men. Or think about bars as homosocial spaces. Of course, all of these things are opening up and have been opening up over the past decades. But also if we think about patriarchy in our side of the planet, a lot of these homosocial spaces did exist very strongly and can continue to be seen in all kinds of arenas that we move in and out of, not in the least in the arena of sports, for instance. So thinking a little bit about these issues. Machismo in Latin America also manifests through a justification of subordination and a justification of violence as a means to achieve subordination. So it's quite intimately tied up with justifications for violence, justifications for instance, beating your wife if you find out that she has been talking with another man or cheating on you, the use of violence as a repercussion for any kind of rule breaking in terms of the gender norms. That means that feminist movements within Latin America often face quite a lot of backlash. And that type of backlash can also be quite violent. Within Latin America, the feminist movements generally rally around two big issues. On the one hand, reproductive rights, and within reproductive rights, the idea that you have ownership over your body. It's not your father or your brother or whatever kind of male that exists in your environment that decides what you can do with your body. The idea that women should be able to exercise autonomy over what they do with their body and also what they do with their reproductive organs. And in that sense, also sexual freedom and the freedom to decide whether they would want to keep or not keep a pregnancy. There have been quite big say this? Sorry, Spanish in my head. Quite big goals that have been achieved over the past years, particularly last year. There was an abortion law finally passed in Argentina, and this was really on the basis of massive amounts of demonstrations. You should imagine thousands of women taking to the streets, not just a little group of people, not a women's march in the sense that we see them here on the 8th of March, but really mass mobilization to achieve, to fight for women's rights in that regard. The other issue, related to reproductive rights and related to this decision of your body and what you do with your body and who you relate with, is also, of course, the sexual diversity aspect of it. And feminist movements within Latin America are often very open to queer alliances and the participation of people from sexual diverse backgrounds in feminist projects. In that sense, it's also important to speak of feminisms with an S, plural, so that kind of work together, that are intersectional, that are decolonial, that are inclusive of queer people, and that are also still at the same time promoting women's rights. So really the step from, let's say, being a women's movement to being an inclusive feminist movement. The other issue that is rallied around a lot is the issue of femicide and impunity. So it's the issue of mobilizing against the naturality or perceived naturality of the male prerogative to enact violence against the female body. And there are two hashtags, so connecting a little bit with the digital world, Ni una menos, which means not one less, and Vivas nos queremos, which is we want ourselves alive. And the Ni una menos movement has really been massive in that regard. Now, the Ni una menos movement, the reason that I'm putting them up as is also a transition to the next set of women that engage in protest, and that is women that engage in protest as mothers. Though the Ni una menos movement is a feminist movement, there are instances of women's movements against femicide that predate the emergence of the Ni una menos movement, which emerged about 5 years ago. And these movements against femicide already date from the late 90s. Maybe some of you do know of this, probably most of you don't. In the late 90s, in Ciudad Juárez, which is a border town between Mexico and the United States, where there's a massive free trade zone and a lot of women who came there to work without families. So also this traditional gender idea, right? Women who are alone and there isn't a man in their lives, there must be something wrong with them. There was a very large discourse around these women who were murdered in Ciudad Juárez, that they were somehow public women, that is to say, prostitutes or women who are engaged in sexual behavior that isn't compliant, let's say, with their gender roles. Of course, their mothers later, when there was a big group of women being murdered, stood up and said, this isn't normal. This isn't one or two murders. This is the systematic murder of women occurring in this particular city. And they started rallying around the moral notion that their daughters were good daughters, that they were good women. So there is always, let's say, within protest movements, and also with this idea, of course, of freedom and justice, there's also always this idea of a good and a bad, right? There's always moral underpinnings of how and why we mobilize. So for the women who mobilized for their daughters, they had the right to erupt on the public stage, to participate in protests, because they were mourning mothers. So from their role as a mother, they engaged in this disruption and this tense antagony with the Mexican state to demand justice for their daughters, who they positioned as good daughters vis-a-vis the state discourse that they were public women. this role of mothers as the forefighters or the bearers of the cross of the violence committed against their children is something that is repeatedly present throughout history. The photo at the bottom is from the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, which is an Argentine mothers organization of the disappeared. In the dirty war in Argentina in the 70s, thousands of people were disappeared, and they, every Thursday, go to the Plaza de Mayo and protest the disappearance of their children and demand clarity from the state, what happened to my children. This is something that is especially prominent in instances of state violence. So as you can see, the women in Juarez demonstrating against impunity, so also holding accountable the state. It's not just about the particular murderer of their daughter, it's about the fact that the state is not doing anything to catch them. So it's about impunity as well. In the case of state violence, the holding accountable of the state, of the military, of the police, in the disappearance of, in this case, male children. So most of the children that were disappeared in Argentina, so, and I say children, but they were adults when they were disappeared in general, were people who were engaged in subversive activities against the Argentine dictatorship at the time. In Nicaragua, which is the country where I do research, have done research for a long time and continue to do research on, the Mothers of April are a same mothers movement who protest to find justice for their children who were murdered during the protests in 2018. Massive anti-government demonstrations emerged in 2018 against the Nicaraguan government, and in those protests, the state's reaction was so strong, more than 300 people were murdered, more than 1,500 people were imprisoned, that also made for women, in the case of AMA, in the case of the Association of the Mothers of April, to rally around the fact that they are mothers of victims, and on the basis of their motherhood, make claims to the state and make claims to justice. Now, within the protest itself, women were protesting alongside men. It was arguably the first time since the Sandinista revolution in '79 that a broad amalgam of different social organizations and people with no affiliation to any kind of social organization or party stood up in a mass protest against the Nicaraguan state. In that, there were, of course, feminist activists participating in this uprising. And these feminist activists had been active in years before as well, so they had some organizational already experience, of course, in mobilizing during protest. But at the same time, we see any kind of, let's say, woman, young and old, also participate in protests. And we see that their role in the protests is just as big as men's roles in the protest. And we also see that in the confirmation of new protest organizations and protest movements, especially those of university students and of self-convened protesters, the so-called autoconvocados, that women play a big role in that, and that they are not going to sit and submissively be quiet while the male students or the men do the talking. In that sense, there's a large section of female leadership. Now, the way in which the state represses men and represses women is slightly different. For instance, when we look at the lethal death toll, we see that it is over 90%, more close to 98%, male deaths. At the same time, when we look at political imprisonment, we see that over 80% are male political prisoners, and a smaller amount of female political prisoners. Yet the care task of maintaining the political prisoners, because the state often They don't provide adequate food. They don't provide medicine. The taking care and maintenance of political prisoners is done by their mothers, on the one hand, wives, girlfriends, sisters on the other. So they're female relations. And I would say that is the case for over 90% of the political prisoners and family members that I have been working with over the past years. The women that are imprisoned tend to be women that have a prominent leadership role. So whereas for men the net is cast quite widely, for women it tends to be especially women targeted that have some kind of leadership qualities or leadership role. The middle picture is the presentation of 4 student leaders and human rights defenders who were, some of them were arrested and imprisoned twice. This is actually the second time that they are arrested in 2019. You can see that their attitude in presenting themselves, when they are presented as being submitted to state power, being presented with these men in the background, with big guns, they stand tall and smile defiantly. This was something that a lot of the political prisoners did at the moment of being presented by the police, to smile and give the impression that we are not going to be beaten into submission. At the same time, currently, the 2 women here at the bottom are imprisoned at this moment. Tamara Davila on the left is a feminist leader and also a member of the National Opposition Bloc, the Blue and White Union. And the older lady is actually a former revolutionary from '79. And she was the leader of a large operation that was, let's say, it was a guerrilla operation that made the former dictator shake in his boots. She is also the first openly lesbian revolutionary in that time. She was considered by most part of society as basically untouchable because of her revolutionary symbolic weight as a woman, as a lesbian woman, as a female revolutionary. Still, the current government, led by Daniel Ortega, which is decidedly anti-feminist, though it tries to pride itself, and unfortunately in international categorization, so for instance the half-half divide of public posts is something that the current government prides itself on keeping and being one of the few countries in the world that keeps to this half-half divide, all the while having imposed a total ban on abortion, the repression of feminist movements, the repression of protest, and the imprisonment of female leaders. So there we also see how sometimes the indicators that we use to measure women's emancipation in countries doesn't always work out in practice. Another instance of protests, and this is the last slide that I have before my conclusion, of women's participation in anti-government protests is the massive protests that erupted in Chile in 2019. The feminist, and especially the feminist anti-abortion movement, played a huge role in mobilization. And you might remember that there was a song that went viral and that was reproduced in a number of countries, not only in Latin America, but even in the Turkish parliament, and even here in Amsterdam on the Dam Square. The song is "A Rapist in Your Path," and I'll just give you the time to read the lyrics, or I'll read the lyrics to you. It says, "Patriarchy is our judge that imprisons us at birth, and our punishment is the vilest you don't see. Patriarchy is our judge that imprisons us at birth, and our punishment is the violence that you can see. It's femicide, impunity for my killer, it's our disappearances, it's rape. And it's not my fault, not where I was, not how I dressed," and they repeat this repeatedly. "The rapist was you. the rapist is you. It's the cops, it's the judges, it's the system, it's the president. This oppressive state is a macho rapist. So in the lyrics to this protest song, which was, as I mentioned, repeated across the world, you can see clearly the fingers pointed at the triad of institutions that police women's gendered being, women's gender roles in society. The first presentation of this song was very symbolically organized on the main square in Santiago de Chile, where we have the presidential palace, the court, right? And the legislative chambers on each side of the square, and the church in the back. So that's a very kind of Latin American setup, the square with the four institutions. So they pointed to each and every of the institutions that are involved in the maintenance of patriarchy and the maintenance of women's oppression. So, what I wanted to say with this presentation is that women are very strongly engaged in a fight for their rights, not just for their rights, for justice and freedom more broadly. I will say I have, of course, not theorized freedom or justice in that sense, but if we look at the local articulations of what these feminist and women's movements demand, then we can also come up with some bottom-up definitions, right, of what they understand as justice and as freedom. In this particular case, justice means the opposite of impunity, and freedom, in that sense, means the freedom to live their lives free from the oppression of patriarchy. So one could say that it is still very much on the end of fighting for at least negative freedoms. Some of these women are engaged in different forms of feminism. Some mobilize building on their role as women in society, as mothers, as sisters, as wives. Some of them combine both. And most of them, I would say, also work together quite strongly with others. So it's not about being an exclusive movement, it's about working together with others. At the same time, we can see that there is a continued persecution of women and feminist movements particularly. And at the same time, we should also take care to gender violence itself, and to also see the ways in which this policing of gendered norms also negatively impacts men, and somehow perhaps precludes men from organizing as men for similar issues such as justice and freedom from these, let's say, this oppressive set of rules, this oppressive framework. That's it for me.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. We now move on to our third and final speaker, Helene Lankeek, who's an advocacy coordinator at Choice for Youth and Sexuality and was this year's NGO representative of the Netherlands to the Commission on the Status of Women. And she will speak about her experience working in international human rights diplomacy from civil society perspective, how you can utilize your freedom to advance women's rights on the international UN stage.
Thank you. Indeed, it's such a pleasure to be in front of actual people again. It's also my first in-person event. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I was asked to tell you something about my work for an NGO. Perhaps it's a career that you aim for yourself. And the topic of today is freedom and women's rights, and the one cannot exist without the other. So I hope to share a bit about my work and viewpoints on the topic today, but I would like to start by asking you a question. So please take out your phone and go to mentimeter.com. I hope that the internet works with us. And the system does as well. I'm presenting from here. Is there When you go to Mentimeter, please enter the code 348 31950. It will be on the screen hopefully in a bit. Misschien moet je hem zo schrijven. Yeah, if we can get it on screen. Sorry, can you repeat the code?
Okay, the code again, if you want it. 34831950. I don't know why this isn't working now. 3483. Yes. 1950.
Yeah. Well, if we cannot see it, then I will just ask you in person. Let's go that way.
Works too.
Yeah?
Can-
All right. So I would like to ask you, what is your dream job? Is anyone brave enough to share with us? Yeah. A diplomat for the Netherlands, or? Okay. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Yes? Thank you. Others here, perhaps the reason that you joined this association? Yeah.
The first president of the European Federation.
I like your ambition. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, well then, how do you think that you can contribute to advancing women's rights in your future work? Or in your current work? I don't know what you do right now. Yes? Yeah, indeed, including female participants in the medical field, very important point. And you, as a diplomat?
Shy to go for like the bigger positions and the more ambitious tasks, and I feel like we have to talk to women and encourage them to take on these chances, because if I may speak for men, but I think they're more like likely to apply for positions that are let's say more challenging, but they are willing to take that risk, and women are more reluctant, more critical towards themselves. So I would like to encourage women to take and apply for positions, even though they might not doubt themselves, to just eliminate that doubt and really go for it. So I think that.
Thank you. Yes. And as president of the EU? Thank you. So influencing and implementing policies that advance women's rights and social position. Excellent bridge to my presentation, so thank you.
because that is also what I try to do in my work. I work for Choice for Youth and Sexuality. We are based in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, but we're not very well known in the Netherlands because we focus our work internationally, and we advocate at the United Nations for such very issues. So, and given your ambitions, you might want to work in a similar position one day as well. Choice is a youth-led SRHR organization. We work with many, many abbreviations. SRHR stands for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights, an integral part of women's rights. It can relate to access to contraceptives, comprehensive sexuality education, and also LGBTI rights. Choice advocates for the SRHR and bodily autonomy of young people. We're youth-led, so no one with us is over the age of 30, and neither of our beneficiaries are either. But also their meaningful participation in decision-making processes. So that means having a seat at the table and actually being listened to and meaningfully engaged. So in my role as advocacy coordinator, and this year I had the honor of being the NGO representative to the Commission on the Status of Women. So that meant that I got to represent Dutch NGOs that focus on feminist issues, on women's rights. And I took position for them in the Dutch delegation during the Commission on the Status of Women. And they negotiated a document this year about the political participation of women in public life and combating gender-based violence that we just heard about. So I try to directly influence such processes and mechanisms at the United Nations to advance progressive norm setting in outcome documents, but also for the system itself to become more youth-friendly, accessible, and inclusive. Because who is included in the text and who gets to speak matters greatly. By having established experience as an organization, we have a large network and a solid reputation in the international field, despite the fact that you might not have heard of us. Choice doesn't only advocate at the UN. We also assist other young people to do so, whether that is remote or in person. And now, remote is, of course, very important, because also the UN started working from home. And given you're all here today in your planned future endeavors, I hope that you will join me in my mission. And that is to make the UN and the opportunities that it brings to us all more accessible. Because it is, actually, a process that is open to everyone. Anyone could participate. But it just seems too far away, too opaque, and too difficult. But I strongly believe it only takes one person to just show you the ropes, and there you go. You could be that person to bring another voice in by sharing your knowledge. And of course, there are obstacles that we encounter and that you will too. Sometimes there's no money to actually travel to the UN, or it is impossible to obtain the right visa. This especially goes for young women, young professionals just like us, but born elsewhere, and simply because they are unmarried or do not own property, both go for me as well, face limitations in traveling. But let's say that you go for it. You found an opportunity and make your way through anyways. Then what could happen if you attend such a UN meeting as a women's rights activist? Not sure how much you are aware of the tactics of the opposition to women's rights, or if this comes up in Model United Nations plays. But I thought it would be interesting to provide you with a glimpse of this. And I should have brought Boris. Boris is a fetus made of plastic. Boris is still in our office currently and a stark reminder of how insidious the opposition could be. Can you imagine having been imprisoned for having a miscarriage and after years of legal battle being released from prison and now addressing the international stage about this grave violation of human rights and degrading, traumatic treatment, only to be handed a plastic fetus moments before speaking? This happens. Or a bus driving through New York, where the headquarters of the UN is, that says that transgender people are here to convert your children and eradicate femininity and masculinity from the world, purely to intimidate you as you walk towards the UN. My colleagues and I are photographed in the hallways of the UN, and our pictures are gathered and spread around with the words, "baby murderer." If you cannot stomach this, this arena is not for you. If you can, we need you there with us. There are also other, less apparent ways to misuse your privilege to advocate on this high level, even through a feminist narrative. Let's say that you're a Swedish radical feminist. As Julianne explained to us, there are different types of feminisms. Choice understands itself as an intersectional feminist organization, and we try to be anti-racist and think about the different intersections that come with thinking about women's rights. Radical feminists, not so much. So let's say you're this Swedish radical feminist and believe that the only empowering sex is free sex. You wish to have the men who pay for the services of sex workers criminalized and pathologized. We call this the Nordic model, or the criminalization of clients. You think the clients are pathetic and violent. They must be hopeless to have to pay for it. The sex workers, which you think are only women, are sad and need help. You apply a false consciousness to them, as they simply don't know what's best for them. They need to be helped and taken out of the work, perhaps deported back to where they came from. You hold them and their clients personally accountable for upholding gender inequality, sex work as a pillar of the patriarchy. The fact that your ideas and the policies that follow from this harm the health and safety of the women you say you want to protect doesn't matter. Unfortunately, this narrative works. This model has been implemented in several European countries and has made sex work more dangerous for those involved. Unsurprisingly, gender equality did not magically appear as a result. And who are you to decide a sometimes last resort for survival, or finessing the patriarchy in your way, if you will, and loving every minute of it, should be as dangerous and harmful as possible? If you would see the women you're aiming to rescue as human beings deserving of human rights and labor rights, we wouldn't be having this conversation. When we try to approach issues we might disagree on a personal level, from a human rights-based perspective, we can speak the same language. So regardless of your future endeavors, your positions that you might hold in international institutions, for a government, if we approach the issues that are sometimes so sensitive, so personal, and that we directly apply to ourselves, sexuality, something so deeply intimate and personal, we, for example, think like, oh, sex work, I could never do that. But that doesn't matter. If we approach things from a human rights-based perspective, we can speak the same language. And hopefully, then, we can agree, move forward, and create positive change for all. Leaving no one behind is perhaps a familiar slogan to you. It's the slogan of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, meant to eradicate poverty, achieve gender equality, building upon the Millennium Development Goals that predecessed it. This can only be achieved if we consider our differences and respect one another anyway. Reprisals are also very real. If you advocate for a certain issue related to women's rights within the UN, if you ever would do so, do not assume that this is a safe space to do that. The motto that I would usually swear by, being nothing about us without us, is simply not always the wisest thing to do, unfortunately. Not only because sometimes your point will come across stronger if it's brought up by different types of people, including people who seem more neutral about the issue, however awful that may be. For example, if I explain racism to you, you might listen to me, but if I were black, you might not. But people have been detained and even killed for their UN advocacy. There are diplomats in the room that, for example, when a Russian activist spoke on LGBTI rights and the propaganda law in Russia, showing vulnerability and sharing his personal story, was intimidated and threatened by him, by a diplomat across the room, during his speech, signaling to slit his throat. There are even officials out there specifically meant to identify you, to identify activists so that you will be hunted down when you return home. They will face repercussions for speaking up. So me speaking up for a peer can be out of protecting her and not out of speaking over her, although I'll gladly give her the floor whenever I can and she dares. But still, activists from all over the world and the activists that we as Choice support in advocating at the UN do speak out. Their courage is admirable. In the previous international program that we were part of, the Right Here, Right Now program, which was one of the strategic partnerships from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's how we work. The government of the Netherlands set certain priorities in terms of human rights, in this case based on SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, to remind you of the abbreviation, and a certain country focus. And an alliance of organizations applies to this and gets to work. In this previous program of 5 years, several people were killed for the same work that I do. So I feel obligated to use the freedom that I enjoy for our common good. I hope that you will also use your freedom to our common advantage. And based on the fact that you're part of the Dutch United Nations Student Association, I'm assuming that you share a feeling of enthusiasm and love for the UN with me. But if you get to work extensively with the UN system in the future for a while, you will, however, inevitably be disappointed as well. Don't let that disappointment turn you cynical, because that will be the moment when you will no longer be able to achieve change. Because I know that you can. And the UN can be the vessel to help you do that, even though this huge and slow bureaucratic system is problematic. You will be right in your disappointment, but there is no alternative that we know. And whatever circus it may seem, whatever circus these international fora are, you can use that, in Dutch we would say, poppenkast, to your advantage, or to the advantage of your beneficiaries. Because being in that space and understanding that space, which you do as being students of international relations, is such a privilege. And that comes with a certain responsibility that I hope you feel. Because you know what your government has pledged to implement or promised to the international audience during their speeches. They are often more progressive and much more positive than the reality on the ground truly is. You can then use this information or share this information with those who need it to hold said government accountable, to actually deliver on what they've pledged. Or as a diplomat, make sure that you do. So I hope to see you in the hallways of the UN. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you'll bear with us for a second, we will move on to the Q&A section. related to care, something that I have discussed at university is paid care for women. So the labour that is done now, which is for free, and having it paid, having it subsidised by the government. I just wanted to know if you had any ideas on this, or if this is something which can realistically be implemented as part of emancipation of women and recognition for what we do.
So it has been in some countries. It's also known as the Nordic model. But that doesn't solve the issue of care, right? So obviously, I think the more resources you devote socially and more structurally to care, say, for children, right, and paid care work for childcare, that would certainly liberate time for women. The problem is then that can create other forms of vulnerabilities, say in the case of the domestic workers, right? So who is being paid to do the care work that inevitably needs to be done? And while we keep on postponing that question, sort of pushing that question aside under the blanket, and then let's not talk about that, and let's talk about big issues about justice in the world, as if we wouldn't have to take care of children, right? So there is nothing about. I think it's about time that we sort of try to tackle this imbalance between the paper realities and the lived realities that Julian was talking about. They're talking about freedom in the abstract, talking about the emancipation of women in the abstract. Remains abstract if women in the north are emancipated of their childcare, say, because women from the south come to take care of their children. And if men don't take care and partake into the caring of children in the family. So it's about, to me, more than allocating resources, which is certainly needed, it's also about a cultural change that would reshuffle care responsibilities for instance, childcare, not only for women, but also emancipating men from their gender norms. I don't know if it answers.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand what you mean. Is there a concrete way to do this, do you think? Because, yeah, often we talk about it theoretically as a thing that should be done.
I can't keep on talking, but so I think that part of the responsibility of that is also for women, right? I think the question of feminism is important, and keep on having. It's a kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because I don't want to sound anti-feminist, but I think there is a lot of responsibility in not addressing core questions if we keep on talking about the right of women. So what's happening in Juárez, in Ciudad Juárez, right? What is happening in the las tesis, right? The last slide that you showed of in Chile, and I know because I'm Chilean, there was a big debate because the las tesis, this protest movement that Julian showed in the last slide, became a world hit, right? So there were performances of las tesis all over the world. Which, by the way, is called las tesis because it's based on the academic work of a Latin American feminist, an Argentinian feminist, Silvia Segato, I think. Which actually I have a question for you about that. Yes. But in my circle, at least, of friends there was a big debate because some of my friends, male friends, were saying, can we participate in the performance? And obviously the answer was, no, you cannot participate in the performance, right? you are potentially the embodiment of the rapist, right? So a way of supporting would be to be absent from the performance. Even if I love las tesis, I do think that indeed the responsibility for a rapist society is not on a single man either, right? And in the same way that women need to be sort of liberated and emancipated, men need to be liberated and emancipated from that cultural burden too. And I don't see as feminists putting enough attention to that. Same for care, for that matter, right? I don't think that the way is to emancipate women from the responsibility of care that is overburdening, because care doesn't disappear, right? That's why I was suggesting that we can't really think about freedom if we don't care about who does the care work that supports that freedom.
Maybe I can add to that. I think there's perhaps two. Thank you. Two related things. One is the problems that arise when we monetize things. So if we monetize care and we want to pay people for the care work that they do, then it directly becomes part of, if you will, the wider capitalist system, or the valuing of work. And then the question, then immediate inequalities arise. Because then indeed is the mother, the white European mother, paid? Or is the Filipino nanny paid? Is that there are inequalities? And there are ways in which care work is already paid for, but it's not sufficient. And I think it has more to do with, rather than monetizing care work, with valuing care work, and with actually talking about the different forms of care work that we do, that we're engaged in, and about the unequal economies that they are part of. And in that sense, that also brings back in the male-female debate, because if we were to monetize it with the idea that then women somehow get paid for the double or triple burden, then we're still not addressing the fundamental inequality between men and women, and the need for men also to be caring beings, and for the recognition that most men are actually caring beings. So I think that there's a number of problems with trying to put a price tag on different forms of care. And in relation to what Daniela was saying, I think that one of the fundamental, how do you say this? I wouldn't necessarily say problems, but sometimes blind sides, let's say, of feminist movements, and definitely plural, so let's say plural feminist movements, is that some are very exclusionary. And on the one hand, there's this justification of the exclusion of men from female-only spaces, or for the creation of safe spaces. But on the other hand, there's also the increasing knowledge and need that men need to be implicated in the feminist agenda, otherwise change isn't going to happen. You cannot make change happen on the basis of half your population wanting a change and then not having the men on your side. And I think that in that regard, maybe we can take some cues from the anti-racist debate, where it is not, where the notion of being an ally becomes important. Feminists need to do a better job at teaching men how they can be allies. And in that sense, I think that a lot can be learned from different social justice movements between one another to be able to lift one another up. And essentially, I think one of the, and that kind of feeds into what you were saying about the radical feminist group. I happen to have had just a bachelor thesis student who did her research on a Mexican radical feminist group, who focus all of their attention on bringing on mobilizing against trans women, essentially arguing that trans women are actually men and that they are invading women's spaces, and highlighting all different kinds of violence that trans women then engage in, which is supposedly masculine and all of these kinds of things, and totally bypassing male violence in a way, and totally bypassing the fact that they themselves are engaging in violence in oppressing a minority. But so let's say the issue is in this creation of exclusionary groups, and I think that we're in the global context. Let's say we're moving at in a stage, and I think that also the digital world and the overlaps that exist between different types of fights for freedom have proven that these fights are able to move along much, I wouldn't necessarily say easier, but more strongly when they are able to join forces, and when they don't engage in the exclusion of others, and when they're able to engage in the conversation and dialogue with others. So that's, I guess, what I would like to.
I think it's a bit of a misconception that feminism is only about women. In my understanding, feminism is about patriarchy. It's about a societal structure, and patriarchy affects all of us, not just women. But it's called feminism. Women are the most obvious, identifiable group that is disadvantaged by this system. But it impacts us all, indeed, in male violence or in men not being able to express emotions fully. I mean, it's under a capitalist, patriarchal society, there are many struggles that we face. And in my intersectional feminism, I try to address all those issues, and that's not easy, and there's no way to get it right, because there's so much, and there's so many different struggles and intersectionalities to take into account. But yeah, I think that, like I said, speaking from a human rights-based perspective, leaning on the systems that we have, even though they might be problematic, can help us at least bring the conversation forward and to see what we can change now in positive sense.
Thank you for your interesting answers. Is there someone in the audience who has a question? Yes? Thank you.
Okay. Hi, so thanks for all the talks. I enjoyed listening. I have a question that may be a bit more practical. So I know that, for example, in the Netherlands, there are still a lot of problems, like you have harassment, you have the wage gap, you have professional clothing that excludes queer people, you have the glass ceiling. Yeah, and there, for example, then the conversation is going. Also, like women nipples are not showed on Instagram and males are. Like there's a lot of stuff. And then the conversation is going, influencers, political systems. There comes a regulation, for example, the quota in public corporations, I think. And then you see, okay, there's no fine adhered to it, and then they kind of do it. But then the lowers below that, you don't see any difference. So does it even make a dent? And I'm just kind of wondering, and even like my parents are saying, we are more prude than when I was a student, so we're kind of going backwards in some ways. And I guess men and women are not fully understanding the problem, and like it's not really, evolving in the right direction, I think. So I'm like, what can we do to kind of get there faster? Because it feels like there's a lot of stuff happening, but nothing is really changing, even when there's regulation and laws. So I was kind of wondering on your views about that.
I can start. You're right that it's not going particularly well, but that's because progress is not linear. We would hope that it is, but it's not. We've seen like these highs and lows of people being able to access their rights, of regulations and conventions being implemented, ratified. I mean, Turkey leaving the CEDAW convention now. So progress isn't linear. It's something that we must keep advocating for, that we must keep fighting for, and be very observant of. So don't count on the fact that you would have the same rights as your parents have had or your grandparents in the future, unfortunately. Consider it like the house market. Currently, it's not that great. Yeah.
Sorry, I think the only thing I can add to that, because I was going to say the exact same thing, that it's never a linear, like progress is never a linear thing that we can only go forward. The one thing I wanted to add to this is that, now I forgot my point. I'm sorry, I'm going to pass it. No, yes, I remember. Yes. Precisely related to the latter part. In the first part of today, the first speaker said that we became complacent. This problem with intellectual complacency. And I think that that's precisely something that sometimes also occurs in the rights domain and in the women's rights domain, especially when you look at the global north. There's this idea, things are only bad in the global south, or they're much worse in the global south, and we forget to mobilize on our end of the world. And on the other hand, we started to take for granted the things that that our parents achieved or that our grandparents achieved. And we forget that we still need to fight for those same things, or that we at least need to make sure that they remain important, so that the framework that exists doesn't turn into the paper reality, that we don't start having that same schism of having wonderful laws and then them not actually being implemented, or there not being incentives for companies or state institutions to actually abide by the laws, because there is no enforcement coupled to the laws. So I think and that last part is something that's perhaps a bit of an issue for people. I'm an anthropologist. For people who are more on the legal or political end of the spectrum, who sometimes believe that so you have to do an immense fight for a policy or a law to be passed. And then there's this thought that, now the law has been passed, now magically it's going to be right. No, we have to constantly hold people accountable for the implementation, and not run into this kind of complacent situation where we start taking things for granted. Or like an even worse type of complacency, which is believing that we're actually in a good place and only looking across the yard to the other person to see where the bad place then is, and not turning blind to what is actually going on around us.
I think it needs to go around the table.
It's very loud.
What you both have said. I just wanted to ask you, so arrive where faster? You ended saying we could arrive there faster. And my question is,
Where's there?
Where? Well, where, for example, the wage gap is non-existent anymore, or people feel, I think 6 in 10 students are
progressed in Amsterdam, I think, female students. I mean, that's way too high a number. And those things like get those numbers down or close the gap or, better situations in my case. Yeah, it's difficult to see the end goal. It's probably evolving as the time goes on, but yeah, it feels like we're going backwards and not forward all the time. So how can we, accelerate the progress in a way?
I would say, what are we valuing, right? Are we valuing as a society to have these policies and to achieve or to have these legislations? And if it's that, I think it's too minimal, right? The same as to believe that democracy works because we vote every 4 years. That is totally insufficient.
Like, I don't think the laws are going to change these types of things, especially with the digital age that we talked about. It's going faster than we are.
So the question of the wage gap, it's an overall question, not only about the gap, it's about how obscene wages are and minimum wages are, and how it's a matter of socioeconomic inequality at a broader sense. That obviously, yes, it affects women, but if you bring it to the realm of care, the pandemic has been super exemplar of how underpaid care workers across the spectrum are, right? Perhaps with the exception of physicians, but only perhaps. So what do we value as a society? And if what we're going to value is, that in a company, male and female employees have sort of the same page for the same type of job, misleading, right? Misleading because it's about how work is valued and work that is needed is valued. So for me it's outrageous, and I don't see us protesting in the streets for how, garbage collectors are paid. And I'm not saying that they should be paid like physicians or university professors for that matter, but they are essential workers. And we are not having a conversation as a society of what is the kind of essential work we need. Because not all of us could work in the UN. We need the UN as we need garbage collectors, as we need professors and childcare carers and so on and so forth. And hence distribute and value as a society. If we keep the discussion into women need to earn the same as men, to me it's a very reductionist discussion about equality and justice.
Maybe I can just really briefly add to that precisely leads to the type of masking that some of the Nicaraguan government engages in when they say 50% of our public officials are women, because they don't have meaningful participation. So if we only look at the numbers, if we only look at, the wage gap between women and men has been closed, then we're not necessarily resolving the problem. So I think precisely what Daniela was saying, we need to look at behind that. What are the values and what do we really want to achieve? And how do we make those changes meaningful rather than only dependent on indicators or variables, and in that sense, sometimes, in some regards, misleading.
One of the questions that I'm wondering is like all these laws for equality, for providing emancipation, of giving the opportunities to women for equal participation, emancipating themselves, are they in some way also symbolic, would you say, because of the, you cannot state that, okay, you have 50-50 male, for instance, in politics and female participation. But for me, that's very symbolic because, like you said, how important are the roles that they are taking and how much can they talk about the issues? Is it like only to symbolize as it's also very familiar to like having like a quota on diversity, in what context. I have friends that are of color, of a different background, and they say, I really feel when I apply for a job that I'm only getting hired because I have, a certain skill, but I don't feel like I'm being hired because they think really see the true value of me, being a employee in the company. And I find that very interesting. And another question I also wanted to ask was, I find a problem when I talk about feminism, not in this crowd. I think everybody is super understanding, but like with regular people that are not familiar with the word feminism, they have like this negative connotation. They, associate it with feminazi. I don't know what kind of language, and I find that very difficult as a woman to explain that it's actually, like what you said, anti-patriarchal. And that's another issue that I want to discuss. How can you approach somebody, to address these issues without, the negative connotations that feminism has at this point?
I think they're very good questions. I'm just going to pass the mic on and just say one thing about the symbolic weight of these types of laws. So on the one hand, laws come into existence, not because they drop from the universe and are somehow implemented, but because people want them to be implemented. So laws in that sense do reflect at least the work of a group of people who want to see certain changes happen and who are acknowledging that certain things exist. So at least on a symbolic level, a law that, for instance, penalizes domestic violence acknowledges the fact that domestic violence exists and that it's something that we would want not to exist. Whether it is then enforced is, of course, a different issue, and that's where law can sometimes become too symbolic or too tokenistic. Like what you were saying about diversity, and what I was just saying about, the quote, the women's quote is that when you have laws that are not really enforced or not accompanied by shared values or education or these kinds of things, then they can become tokenistic and kind of lose or somehow emptied of some of the value and also some of the symbolic weight that they do carry. So when laws are passed that are symbolically very important and then their implementation is very tokenistic, then they lose some of the very weight that they are supposed to carry. And I think that that's something that we need to be careful of and to have perhaps a better understanding of, in that sense, how legal orders are built and how we can then move with them or work with them as a society. And in regards to the United Nations, I fully understand like the frustration with some of the workings of the United Nations, because it has such a symbolic weight, right? And then sometimes the way in which the mechanisms operate, the time that it takes, the show around, it kind of sometimes also empties it of the very weight that it's supposed to carry. And I think we're in, maybe this was said 30 years ago or 50 years ago, we're in a crucial era where we're kind of rethinking how these types of supranational collaborations work, how these, what are, the global values, and discussing the global values and also the inequalities in these values, and trying to not be imperialistic and these kinds of things. And that calls into question some of the very things that used to carry a lot of weight. And we see that in the case of the UN also with the difficulty of multiple geopolitical powers exerting influence over it, and then it not being able to, or it's stagnating, let's say, in its capacity to enforce change. But like my colleague here was saying, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage in it. And it doesn't mean that we should stop making laws. It doesn't mean that we should stop going to the UN. But it shouldn't be the only thing that we do, perhaps.
Yes, indeed. If you want to see results of your own efforts, the UN is not the space for that. In local governments, like really municipality level, city level, sometimes even national, you can see, sometimes directly see what your own efforts result in, or you perhaps know the people that it impacts directly. With the processes of the UN, not so much. You never quite know what your personal impact or the impact of your organization has been in such a huge process. But, like like I said in my statement, what is the alternative? There is no. But even then, what is the alternative if you leave that space? Is then the person who hands out the plastic fetus taking over? And then what happens if people who think that way have all the space they want to advocate on this high international level? And then how will that trickle down to national level or local level policies? What will then happen? So that's why I think it is important to engage. I try to start as progressive as possible, and I always know that that will not make the end line of the negotiation. So if you become a diplomat, and I really, really hope that you keep holding on to your feminist values and try to be as progressive as you can, because also as a government diplomat, you absolutely can, especially for the Netherlands. But you need to be very pragmatic as well, because you will have to negotiate and give some things away in the negotiation process. And then you must always think about what we call the red lines. So what line are you not willing to cross? So for example, in my experience in being the NGO representative this year for the Commission on the Status of Women of the Netherlands, I was part of the Dutch delegation in that process, and I knew that from the government, they did not want to water down agreed language. So all of these discussions that are held there about this particular document this year about political participation of women and combating violence is based on previously agreed language. What have we discussed last year, 5 years ago, in New York at the General Assembly, but also in Geneva? And we can use that language again, or we can say, well, actually, we don't really want to commit to that again. And Russia was being a pain in the ass in the negotiations and wouldn't accept language from the Geneva UN space anymore, but only from previously agreed CSW language, so the Commission on the Status of Women. This already really limits how progressive your text can be, but also sovereignty clauses built into the text can water down the language, where you would say, we hope to achieve sexual and reproductive rights for all, where appropriate to national law or traditional and cultural practices, etc., etc. So really, it waters it down what you can do with it, basically, on a national level, after that whole conference ends. And this is that circus that I mentioned. It's so politicized and it's so difficult to be progressive and to have the people that you're speaking from, or even the community that you are from, included in the text. Myself, as a lesbian woman, I don't see myself reflected in the text that I negotiate. That's hurtful. And I know that that impacts people like me all across the world, that I'm too deviant and too controversial to be included in a UN text. But it also differs per process. So if you take the UN processes in New York, they're very much focused on development. So the Commission on Population and Development, Commission on the Status of Women. We discuss a certain topic and think about how would we want to continue on this issue? What is happening in the world on this topic, and where do we want to go? And then after we agree, you can do with that information whatever you like, basically. However, the mechanisms in Geneva, the human rights mechanisms, are more fit for accountability work. And now in the pandemic times, I definitely noticed that there's more and more of an emphasis on these mechanisms because they're more suited for accountability and thus to achieve real change. That also takes into account who speaks, who gives the recommendations. For example, in the Universal Periodic Review, where the human rights framework of the country is reviewed, it's not me from civil society given the recommendation to you as the state, but it's other states doing so. So if you are a diplomat from the Netherlands, I would approach you from England, you from Spain, you from Angola, to give you a recommendation on what should change in the Netherlands. You're much more likely to listen to another state because there are so many other things involved, like trade relations, economic dependencies, etc., that you would want to uphold because it benefits you. I know that, so I can make use of that. So pragmatism is very important. And in how feminism is being viewed in your social circle, yeah, you're likely just to continue to be seen as this sour, humorless woman. But don't let that stop you. It's, sometimes it helps to just to continue to explain and yeah, don't try to be off your high horse and like that you know the theories behind it, so you will tell them what's best. Also try to see what their perspective is, because oftentimes you will see there's actually, when speaking to a female friend, for example, that there's an internalized misogyny there, or internalized homophobia, or also in how both men and women view not only womanhood, but also femininity. Femininity is demonized in men, but also in women. And that impacts so much of how we see care work, of how we see gay men, effeminate gay men, of how we see feminine women. So, yeah, I once saw this quote, like, by now we have learned that a woman can achieve anything she sets her mind to, but now we must learn that she can also look like a woman while doing so. That would be the next step, in my view.
Yeah, I perhaps would like to emphasize what you're saying about pragmatism and be attentive to what is needed in the given context that you are advocating for change. Because sometimes, like you were showing in your presentation about protest, sometimes it's about restating traditional roles, say as mothers, right? And that role is powerful too. So in advocating for the emancipation of women, not to forget that for many women, motherhood is important, and for many others, it is not. So in my own experience, the reason why I would define myself as a feminist is because indeed I would advocate for the choice of any woman to exercise, if they want, maternity as they see fit, right? Independently of their sexual orientation and so on. So I think it's important not to be complacent with what gender emancipation means or traditional gender roles are either, because sometimes traditional gender roles can be used and can be put in place in order to transform prevalent norms of inequality or subordination. Same for trans people, right? So the fact it's not accidental that sometimes for trans people they actually reinforce visually an image of a gender stereotype in order to make a claim about their right to claim that space too. And in that you need to be pragmatic and to see, depending on talk about laws and we talk about policies, but look around the city too. Look around the spaces we inhabit. And I just supervise actually, and perhaps say this in the back of my head because I just supervise a student who did a work on accessibility to public toilets in Amsterdam. Guess what? Women have it very bad. Very, very bad. Disabled bodies, badly called disabled bodies, even worse, right? Trans people, let's not talk about it. So, what kind of cities where do we want to go? What kind of cities do we want to live in? What kind of infrastructures would enable us in our differences to feel equal and to have equal access? And for me, that is as important as a law that would recognize equality.
Thank you for the question. It's definitely something I relate to, and thank you for your answers. I actually wanted to add on that I did a research project with a municipality in North, and the public bathroom issue came up, of course. And yeah, they did say that they were implementing it, so hopefully public bathrooms for women will change in a positive direction and they stick to their word. Is there another question?
Hi, thank you so much for all the interesting answers and presentations. And I was just curious, I don't know if it's a good question, but what is your biggest hope for the future of the feminist movement? What do you think is most important to happen next, if that makes sense?
No small question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. It's a big question. It's definitely a good question, so don't worry about it not being a good question. I think one of the issues that we're facing in a world also with the digital realm where we have these information bubbles and where there is increasing polarization occurring, I think one of the important things to take into account as feminists is also to keep open the dialogue. Dialogue is very important in order to be able to forward your agenda. And in that sense, I very much agree that you need to be very, perhaps radical in exerting and putting out your demands. And you need to be very clear of the red lines that you have in terms of what are you willing to water it down to. But if you stop voicing radical demands, then you're never going to get your red line, let's say. So while it's very important to continue voicing those radical demands, it's also important to build coalitions and to build dialogue and to prevent, from becoming isolated or put into a box where people don't want to talk with you anymore, and these kinds of things. And just one thing that I want to add, as this is probably going to be the last question, is that what I noticed from engaging with protesters and from engaging as let's say, an activist academic with protest and with the protest movement in Nicaragua, which is very plural, is that everybody matters. Every small thing that we do has an impact. I had no idea that as in 2018, when the protests took place, I was also graduating from my PhD research. I had no idea that being suddenly a doctor and considered a country expert would provide me with a platform from which I could effectively try to influence public opinion or make change or try to enter, for instance, the Genevan human rights bodies, participate on making human rights reports, and try to bring the context from Nicaragua, which is so far from here and so unknown in this particular time that the world is in. The fact that Nicaragua exists is probably for some of you, well, you probably knew it exists, but not that there were things going on there since 2018. Every little step that we make does have an impact, and don't feel that you have to wait until you are a full professor, that you have to wait until you are the representative that speaks before the UN, or until you have a doctoral degree, to be able to make your voice count. There are things that we can do, and in that sense also what she was saying about participating in local initiatives, participating in local government, showing up at protests, being one of the 1,000, or even being one of the 20. I sometimes participate in protests of the Nicaraguan diaspora here, and it's a very small group, but it matters. It matters that the images are shared on social media with people there. It keeps up morale. So the things that we participate in, that we put our bodies in, that we put our minds and our time in, are made valuable. So all of you have the possibility to put your time, your attention, your bodies out somewhere. And if you decide to do that for a particular cause, then that has an impact already. So you don't have to wait until you are the president of the European Federation in order to make the change.
It's a big question. I think what I would like to strive for, what I would hope to eventually see is that even if we have these very, very abstract and general concerns, and we might share sort of the value of human rights and the value of or the defense of freedom or equality, I would like to see a world where there is much more local ownership and empowerment of local communities to define how they want to build their societies. And I know that might lead to backlashes and reactionary responses because of the way to say the church have in local communities or particular traditions or norms. But I don't think we're gonna advance much if it's only about imposing a liberal agenda on these backward zones of the world, right? I don't think that is the way development should keep on being understood and conceptualized. And in that, I think what you say, dialogue is fundamental. Mostly because in my experience and what I have seen and learned against my initial premises is that often the reaction and the defense in these local communities, or the more conservative response, is because of actually care, right? Is misunderstood, or I don't know, in my view misunderstood, right? But say child marriage, right? It took me years to actually come to terms with understanding that often in remote areas is the strategies families have to secure the care of their daughters. And I was not willing to accept it, right? For a long time. And so there is nothing I can do. Now, what I can do now is to avoid stereotyping that type of practice as a backward practice. And for me, instead of, when we talk about child marriage, instead of only talking about the right of the girls to be girls and to their education and remain with the families and so on, it's also about what type of living situation in general exists there that implies for those fathers and for those elders that care means means to give these girls away. How can that change? And if we could actually make, say, the development more complex and aware of those nuances, then perhaps we can advance into a more caring society rather than one that is only advocated for rights in the abstract.
I had a lot of time to think, but I still don't really know. What I would like is, for example, to walk alone at night and not think about it. Or to hold my partner's hand and not think about it. Or think about how that would be perceived if I would have been born in Iran and what the repercussions would have been for me then. In terms of feminism, I hope that we don't lose our fight in this division that we see. Liberal and radical and intersectional, and it's tiring, but perhaps also a sign of maturing and changing movement. But I hope that you, in your feminism, and everyone here and in your work, regardless of the opposition that you face, to not become cynical and to continue to approach with love and with the desire to achieve positive change and to keep trying. Because I think that if you can identify what you think is wrong, then you can have a say in changing that issue, and you might not see the end result of that, or you might not even know what the end result is, but try anyway. And yeah, working in local policy is oftentimes much more rewarding. I started working with a municipality on local LGBTI policy years ago. That's very rewarding. And but also I learned, given the topic of this year's CSW, local government is also a good way to start for a young woman with ambitions of becoming a diplomat, for example, to advance your political career or to learn a lot or just to change as much as you can. So I hope you will too.
Thank you very much. I think this concludes session 2. Thank you very much for coming and giving up some of your time to speak to us. It was very insightful, very interesting, and thank you for answering our questions. Now, for the audience, there is an opportunity to go to a bar. The person who will take you there has elapsed my memory, but I'm sure she will make herself soon. And I believe it is somewhere in Overton. So if you're interested, please stick around. Thank you for coming.
Oh, yes.